The topic today is beyond the left and right. So beyond the binary political system in most Western democracies lies an entire spectrum of views, opinions and beliefs. The left and the right drifting further towards their extremist factions, locked in an ideological race to the bottom. This has left the rest of us caught in the middle, disillusioned by the left and right dichotomy, which seems to be growing more and more toxic day by day. So, what exactly is beyond left and right politics? The following speakers will share their view of what this topic means to them and their journey beyond the red and blue to somewhere over the rainbow. First up, we have Jonathan Blanks. He's a research associate in Cato's project on criminal justice and a writer-in-residence at Harvard University's Fair Punishment Project. His research focuses on law enforcement practices, overcriminalization, and civil liberties. Jonathan has appeared in numerous television, radio, and internet media, including HuffPost Live, Bloomberg Law Radio, Voice of America, The Washington Post, Chicago Tribune, Vice, and many, many more. So please welcome Jonathan Blanks.
Thank you so much. Tim asked me to talk today a little bit, something I've written about that might seem a little strange. So give him a little bit of personal background. I look white, but my father was black. I grew up in a black neighborhood in Fort Wayne, Indiana. And if you look at the American libertarian scene, you'll notice it is typically very white, very male. Our interns have gotten a little bit, have become more diverse over time, but this is something that the libertarians are already somewhat on the margins of society, margins of American politics, have had a hard time breaking in with people who should hate the government as much as the rest of us. This is going to be primarily about the American libertarian movement and its context, but I think it has sort of broader implications that I think that Australians and the international liberty movement can also take. So a couple years ago, one of my colleagues asked me, he's like, can you write why there aren't more black libertarians? And I was like, sure, I could give it a shot. And I ended up coming up with about 10,000 words, breaking it up over 2 essays. And what I did in my research came up with that it's a long, long story. I don't have that much time. But insofar as we have a really bad history problem. Americans don't like to admit their history, and libertarians, because so much of what we believe is tied so much to the American founding and the beauty of the good old days when we were going to have a limited government, we throw off the crown, everything was great. But unfortunately, there were some very seedy people who were involved in the founding. There were ideas, obviously we enshrine slavery in our Constitution. These are problems that stay with us today. When you hold up people like Thomas Jefferson as a hero, a man who, let's be completely frank, he was a child rapist, this is not something that screams freedom to people who don't look at that as their own personal history, who are on the other side of that. And as that goes on through American history, it becomes Civil War revisionism, where the South was right because we're fighting for states' rights and federalism. But the fact of the matter is states' rights is often used as a defense or a veil for the right to be racist. Now, granted, as in a libertarian ideal, people should be able to believe whatever they want, and I understand that. But insofar as a political movement, that's what states' rights means to other people. Federalism has done so much for American freedom. Federalism is where our gay marriage movement came from. Certain states started legalizing, spread across the country. Marijuana legalization started in states. It's moving all across the country. Federalism is not a bad thing. But unfortunately, the way that we've been selling libertarianism for so long is backward and has just done us no favors. Beyond that, the most libertarian major presidential candidate in history of the two parties, the Republicans and the Democrats, was Barry Goldwater. Barry Goldwater got a lot of his popularity by opposing the Civil Rights Act. Now think of what you will of the legislation. That he became famous because he opposed the ending of segregation in public accommodations, hotels, restaurants, that sort of thing. And it was a principled stand, and I understand it. And I don't think Barry Goldwater was personally racist. However, if that is the hill you're going to die on, and you're saying that's what liberty means, the liberty that I can't travel across my country and know that I'm going to have a place to stay, or that I'm going to be able to sit down at a restaurant, that's going to be a problem. And then you move on to the most recent, like, libertarian hero in American politics, which was Ron Paul, and he's got his own baggage. He, for about 20 years, he had these newsletters, which he fundraised, and he sent it throughout Texas and throughout the country. And I'll give you a little taste of what some of the stuff he published under his name. Opinion polls consistently show that 5% of blacks have sensible political opinions, i.e. they support the free market, individual liberty, the end of welfare, and affirmative action. He goes on to say, given the efficiency of what the District of Columbia laughingly calls the criminal justice system, I think we can safely assume that 95% of black males in that city are semi-criminal or entirely criminal. We constantly are told that it is evil to be afraid of black men, but it is hardly irrational. Black men commit murders, rapes, robberies, muggings, and burglaries, all out of proportion to their numbers. I wonder why there aren't more black faces at libertarian events. Okay? So, it's all about packaging, right? Libertarian ideas have been very popular, and American ideals have been popular among the Black American movement, Black American history, the entire time they've been on the continent. Just to pick a few, Frederick Douglass, anti-slavery, didn't trust the government, pro-Constitution, thought the Constitution was fundamentally an anti-slavery document. Madam C.J. Walker, first black millionaire in the country, was an entrepreneur. She's founded a black hair care and makeup business out of my home state of Indiana and built a fortune. Probably a surprise to some of you, Malcolm X. Hated the government, believed in entrepreneurship, believed in personal self-defense. These are not ideals that are foreign to black people at all. The difference is that these people recognize the problems the state continued to place on black people. That today all the laws have been taken down that required segregation. Our cities are still segregated. And those affect public schooling. And of course, when you have separate and unequal public schooling, you're going to have separate and unequal outcomes. And you have separate and unequal policing, where people are policed in unconstitutional ways in black neighborhoods that it would never get away with in white neighborhoods. And so we have to think about, what is it, why aren't more black people coming to libertarianism? And I'll give you an instance of my brother. My brother is, he's an evangelical. He is a gun owner. He's a pharmacist. He grew up black in the 1960s and 70s in Indiana. Loves the church. Personal responsibility is his thing. Wouldn't vote Republican if you paid him. And because libertarians have been so closely connected with the Republican Party of the United States because of the mostly Cold War fusionism, that the idea that people come to listen to libertarian talk, people think I'm a Republican. No, particularly not in the current iteration of the Republican Party, which doesn't like trade, doesn't like immigration, doesn't like criminal justice reform, the whole mess. And so it's these bad bedfellows that the libertarians have been with for a very long time. And the idea is that we keep harping on these things that have been dog whistles for a very long time. Yes, welfare can harm a community, but it's not the only thing that the state does that can harm the community. But this is what you hear, because for years, welfare, beating the anti-welfare drum was a Republican, it was just a talking point that they were going to use. And what they were doing is it was a racist dog whistle. Keep in mind, most people in welfare in the United States are white. But when you heard welfare in the American political discourse, you know what they meant. And so if that's the only thing libertarians are offering, you're not going to sell it. And this is just basic business practice. We're all supposed to be for entrepreneurship and free markets. You do not go to a group of customers and say, oh, it's not us. who aren't buying your product. Oh, it's not us, it's you. You are the people that are messing up. And that's just bad salesmanship. So I think the key to success in the broader society is understanding that American society has failed to live up to its principles, and the libertarians believe in those principles very strongly, but they have to also understand how society has failed to live up to those ideals. They have to understand that they have to meet people, meeting them with their lived experiences. It's not that people don't believe in free markets. It's not that people don't believe in entrepreneurship. It's not that they don't believe in fairness. And yes, social justice warriors, identity politics, it gets overwrought. They go too far, I get it. But that doesn't mean that they're always wrong. And I think it's really important that libertarians internalize that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jonathan. Okay, next up we have Karen Foley. Karen first came to prominence in 2012 when she took the controversial step of burning her proof of Aboriginality certificate and writing about her decision on the ABC's The Drum website. Since then, she's continued to share her views on Aboriginal affairs, identity, politics, and freedom of speech by appearing on the Bolt Report and writing for media such as The Spectator, Australia, Quadrant, The Australian, and Penthouse Australia. She has also contributed to several books, including Making Australia Right and Recognise What? Essays on Aboriginal recognition in the Australian Constitution. So please welcome Karen Foley.
All right, thanks Cody, and thanks everyone for being here. I'd initially planned to talk about what the left does wrong and what the right is doing wrong in pretty much the same fashion, but then I thought, well, who am I to get up and talk about what everyone else is doing wrong? Because there's plenty of things that I could have handled better over the last 5 years or so since I switched tribes, so I thought some of those things might be useful for you to hear about. Oh, it's better. My first piece of advice is that if you're a political oddity, meaning that if you have a point of view that doesn't fit with the narrative for your sex, for your race, or for your ethnicity or whatever, you need to package your backstory for public consumption. Because a lot of people won't be able to process your ideas until you've given them a story that explains why you have those ideas. That's a story of what you were born as, what you were born into, some formative experiences, your epiphany. And then you can get on with what you're actually there to talk about. I learnt that the hard way when I did the Bolt Report, and I was shit. Because I thought I was there to talk about Aboriginal recognition in the Constitution, which I think is misguided. But the topic really turned out to be, why did you do a crazy thing like burn your certificate of Aboriginality? You know, Karen, why are you crazy? Now, Andrew Bolt, he's a nice man, and he I don't think he does think I'm crazy, but he was just actually giving me the opportunity to give people what they want. And I should have been prepared for that. But because I hate doing it, I wasn't prepared because it feels undignified. And sometimes I would feel that it was a bit manipulative or whatever. And I maintain that my reasoning should be sufficient and that people should either accept or reject my ideas on their merits. But the world doesn't work that way. People want to know your story. They want to understand why you think the way you do. They want to know why you're crazy. So just briefly, for those of you that don't know me, so those ideas that I think people should consider on their merits are things along the lines of, firstly, affirmative action doesn't work. It only benefits people like me, people who look like me and talk like me but who are Aboriginal. It only benefits people like me, and those benefits that would come to people like me are dependent on keeping other Aboriginal people in a state of dysfunction. So that's one of the crazy things that I think. Prioritising an Aboriginal child's culture over their safety and welfare is abhorrent. Traditional Aboriginal culture is nothing to get sentimental about. And the state has no business limiting free speech. And speech that may offend people on the basis of their race is still speech that people must be free to express. So it's things like that. Now, Andrew Bolt wouldn't generally ask a middle-class white guy saying exactly the same things, what might have happened to him in his life to make him turn out the way he did. Because nobody cares. The guy's not strange, he's saying perfectly reasonable things, because I think they're perfectly reasonable things. He's not puzzling, which means he's also nothing special. He's competing with a bunch of other not-so-special guys to get a spot on TV or in the paper, and it's tough. It's competitive. So then when I suddenly appear out of nowhere and get a whole lot of attention just for being strange, a bit of resentment is to be expected, and it's kind of understandable. The thing was, from my point of view, I wasn't all that thrilled to be by all the sudden attention I was getting, because I'd already experienced this sort of adulation that you get on the left when you're Aboriginal, where everyone's desperate to have an Aboriginal friend, and you're this amazingly wise and spiritual being, and you get achievement awards just for showing up. So I was a newcomer to the right, but I was already pretty jaded and pretty uncomfortable with too much flattery and overexcitement. And as a result, I was probably more defensive and cagey than I needed to be. Now, some of those not special guys who had always worked hard to get somewhere on the right saw me getting all this attention and not being as giddy with delight about it as I probably should be. So there was plenty of goodwill, don't get me wrong, there's plenty of goodwill, but that difference in our attitudes and perspectives and where we were coming from might have led some to see me as being pretty ungracious and a bit unappreciative of the profile I was getting. But that's the perspective that I was coming from. And now I'm embarrassed to say that I cared too much about that. I was trying to fend off the resentment with all this endless acknowledging, and some of the earlier stuff that I wrote, you could see it, and I read back over it and go, just acknowledging that I know it's just because I'm strange, and I know I'm not saying anything actually brilliant or original, I'm saying what you guys are saying. But that was just such a boring waste of words. If people resent you, and they might have good reasons for doing so, you can't do anything about it. And you do get similar resentment on the left, by the way, where you have a contingent of people who've built their careers on being experts on working with and working for Aboriginal people. So then when an Aboriginal person comes along who's just as capable as they are, they don't like it, but they're not in a position to express that very openly, of course. Another dumb idea that I had was that I needed to earn my stripes and establish some credibility as a serious thinker in this space. And as a result, I missed opportunities to connect with a broader audience from the outset because I didn't want to come across as some oversharing woman going on about my lived experience, but the personal stuff is what people engage with. I think I could have achieved more if I hadn't been quite so concerned about establishing cred with people whose opinions of me don't actually matter. Now, these guys on the right, they weren't my audience. They were just a vehicle for reaching an audience. For a while I forgot that those people were a means to an end, not an end in themselves. Perhaps sometimes they forget that too. And I've got here, they can be a bit insular, is what I've said, but we're all insular. Like that's not confined to the right or the left. It's just the nature of any scene. Just need to be fair on that point. Something else I'd hear quite a bit was, oh, it's all right for you, you can say these things and get away with it. But no, it's not all right. I'd rather these things didn't need to be said at all. I should say I'm mostly moaning about the right today, but I haven't forgotten what the left does to people. There's a reason why I'm not there anymore. In particular, I haven't forgotten this relentless targeting and persecution, mostly of really defenceless people pretty low down the totem pole, that goes on in workplaces in the name of cultural sensitivity and anti-racism. And the unions seem to be pretty complacent, indeed, complicit in that process. And that's a piece of work that I think I still need to do, telling some of those stories in a way that might connect with people beyond this scene. Not that I think it would, well, it sounds a bit too pessimistic, but not that I think it would make much of a difference though, because this stuff is political poison. It's hard for the think tanks and the research institutes on the right to attract both the dollars and the skills to do that sort of work. For an ambitious young policy wonk, Aboriginal stuff is a career-limiting field compared to some of those big social and economic issues that put you in the orbit of influential people. And it's not complex and interesting in the way that something like health policy is. Because how many ways can you say what we're doing doesn't work and it's really fucking dumb and it's hurting people? It gets boring. saying it over and over. You've got, and I always like to do a shout out to this person, you've got Jeremy Samet in the Centre for Independent Studies doing some great work on child protection, which means going right into the Aboriginal affairs heart of darkness, and he's actually influencing the policy agenda. And I think just in the news yesterday he had a big win, or there was a big win around adoption law, but that's one guy. Personally, I think these policy organisations on the right have more resources they could put towards this really fundamental problem that we have in this country than one guy. But like I just said, I understand the politics, that it's difficult to attract donors and brains to work on this stuff. But Christopher Hitchens said, if you really want something to change, you have to be prepared to be boring about it. So you keep trying to find new ways to say the same thing. And I'll admit I haven't been doing enough lately. The difficulty is the publications that support your point of view are read by people who already support your point of view. So you can feel like you're preaching to the choir. And there's a point where you do have to ask yourself, is this still the best use of my energies? But where do you take your energies instead if you want to reach different people? And as you all know, our media is so polarised, so it's no wonder that we can end up in these echo chambers where the language gets kind of loose because, we're all on the same page, so we all know what everybody else means. And a picture of that girl with a smiley brown face and a headscarf who tweets about our Anzacs is enough to make our heads explode. Yeah? I'm getting on my high horse here because you might see Yasmin Abdul-Megeed as a personification of everything that's despicable about the left and the ABC and whatever else, but she isn't the left, she isn't the ABC, she's just this girl, and it's just sort of one example of this piling on is just, I'm getting on my high horse, it's classy and it's a really bad look, and it is alienating people from some of the messages that we might actually want them to engage with. Anyway, for those of you that are still with me, so you keep publishing stuff where you can, but a profile as a writer isn't that much use unless it makes stuff happen. And if you want to make stuff happen, I'd suggest you affiliate yourself with a group or an organisation that shares your interests. And then you'll have something I don't have, which is legitimacy. Then when they're interviewing you on the TV, that bit underneath your name says something about, you'll have your name and then your role within a certain organisation, instead of just your name and lone nutter, which is mine. Speaking of nutters though, and this is probably pretty obvious advice, don't affiliate yourself with a bunch of lunatics, no matter how many views they get online and no matter how big they are worldwide. The leadership of those organisations might be gaining influence and feeding off the fan base, i.e. you, but you'll gain nothing good from having your name linked to theirs. It's a bit difficult for me to align myself with any particular organisation in any formal way, given that the whole position I established for myself was based on a refusal to trade in race politics. So any vaguely formal-looking affiliation makes people assume I'm on the payroll and therefore a hypocrite. So I'm snookered in a way that you don't have to be if you're smart about it. So if you take home any message from this, just be smarter than me. One last piece of advice, if you're planning to be a shit stirrer in some capacity and you're not independently wealthy, it helps to be indispensable at work, preferably in something techie, where they can't touch you or get rid of you terribly easily. Keep your overheads low and keep a stash of money aside if you can, because it means that instead of being terrified that you'll be sacked and run out of town, you'll just be really worried all the time, which is just a bit more manageable. I can't say whether or not it's all worth it because it's not really a choice. It's more of a thing you do because you just can't help the way you are. And given that a lot of you have sacrificed your weekend for a festival of politics, I dare say a few of you are that way too. And if so, I hope that this advice has been useful. Thank you.
Okay. A riddle wrapped in an enigma, wrapped in a black suit. Depending on who you ask, Liberal Democrats National President Gabe Buckley is either a libertarian messiah, a recalcitrant shit stirrer, or the Prince of Darkness himself. Viewed by many, well, some, or rather himself, really, as the spiritual successor to Johnny Cash, our very own man in the black walks the philosophical line between non-violent resistance to all-out agorist rebellion in a pair of size 13 cowboy boots. A member of the Liberal Democrats leadership party team for almost a decade, Gabe has been president since early 2014, overseeing the transition from also-rans to parliamentary party in the process. A vocal proponent of drug reform, freedom of association, freedom of movement, and freedom of speech, one of the highlights of his advocacy was in 2013 when he, along with 3,000 hairy bikers, went straight to Parliament House in Brisbane after the introduction of draconian anti-consorting laws our country has ever seen. Despising injustice in all forms, nothing has his jimmies rustled like seeing the government stick a filthy jackboot on the neck of those unable to defend themselves. Please welcome Gabe Buckley.
Cody Neville, everyone. First time at Friedman and doing a bang-up job. And look out for the name because I think she's going to be a star in the party soon. Like a lot of people, I went through a fairly bad breakup in my early 20s. Unlike most of my breakups, this one wasn't with a woman, it was with an ideology. And to be precise, I divorced myself from the left. That's right, the brash, uncompromising, unhyphenated anarchist standing before you is nothing more than an unreconstructed Marxist. Not quite, but for a not insignificant amount of time, I, like a number of people in the Liberal Democrats, found a home on what was then known as the Labor Right, a faction that would be better painted as centre-left on the overall political spectrum. Like many of my cohort, I kind of embody that old saying, if you're not a communist by the time you're 20, you've got no heart, and if you're not a capitalist by the time you turn 30, you've got no brains. The late 80s and early 90s, and yes, I am that old, were a pretty good time to be a young lefty. At that time, the left still embodied enough of the things that young people are fairly naturally drawn to, that a wild-eyed boy from the bush might have felt like he had found his rodina. The left were rough and tumble. You know, they smoked rollies, they drank cheap beer and sported tattoos, barracked for Collingwood and Footscray. You know, they told dirty jokes. And that was just the women. You know, they ate steak and chips in the front bar and listened to Jimmy Barnes and the Angels and Rose Tattoo. You know, the Painters and Dockers, named after the dodgy maritime union, you know, sang about going to school in the nude. And when the Radiators released a song titled Gimme Head, the left just giggled like schoolchildren, roared out that chorus. The flare-ups of the Cold War and the bitterness of the Vietnam conflict were still fresh enough in everyone's minds that the left were passionately anti-war. As the Reagan administration ramped up the drug war and stockpiled nuclear weapons in the US, the Australian left were vocal proponents both of harm minimisation and nuclear disarmament. When censorious fingerwaggers tried to ban Bret Easton Ellis's book American Psycho, it was the left who mounted a very spirited defence of free expression. In fact, it was noted lefty Morris Byers, QC, a good mate of Gough Whitlam's actually, who managed to convince the High Court to rule that all voters are entitled to make comment on political issues. Our Prime Minister at the time was a cricket bat swinging, yard glass sculling old school union brawler. Now just try to imagine for a moment Richard Di Natale or Bill Shorten strapping on the pads and heading out to the crease, helmetless, for the Prime Minister's 11 and staring down a John Maguire bouncer. No. Despite his everyman persona, Bob Hawke had a fairly keen eye for policy, Australia card notwithstanding, and the Hawke-Keating era actually managed to kick off and bring home some of the most important economic reforms of the 20th century. The centre-left in Australia, had we shed a few of our more meddlesome policy ideas, we would have been indistinguishable from our left libertarians of today. It was no happy accident that the left of my youth believed in the things that they believed in. For most of our history, working class Australians have embodied a philosophy of hard work, honest living, family, community, mateship, minding your own business, and hard work and giving everyone a fair go. They're distrustful of experts. You know, bureaucrats and academics, they're often downright hostile towards politicians and the police. They may have been a little bit iffy about the wogs, chinks and dagos, but as soon as each wave of immigrants started proving themselves on the building site, and more importantly on the football field, no worries, cubby, you're one of us. The fact that the Southern Cross adorns not only the flag of the Liberal Democrats, but also the flag of the CFMEU is not as incongruous as it may seem. But we flash forward a few decades, and the modern left bears little resemblance to the left I once held very dear. Narcissistic modern left have not simply abandoned the working class, they've turned 180 degrees and levelled swathes of their nasty, small-minded vitriol at the people who, up until that point, were basically the rank and file of the movement. Once vaunted as battlers holding firm at the front of the picket line, they're now our blue-collar brothers and sisters are now reviled by a left that's more concerned with cultural appropriation than collective bargaining. About the only group of people that the left actually hates more than the working class these days is us. From their campus ivory towers and trendy inner-city coffee shops, they're... Sorry. The left, they sneer in a westerly direction. People who live out in those vast housing tracts beyond the leafy inner city suburbs are bogans and westies, and a lumpen proletariat of uncivilised barbarians who wouldn't know an artisanal fair trade kale smoothie if it jumped up and bit them on their hairy asses. They're demonised as xenophobic environmental vandals, simply for refusing to fall in line with a postmodern narrative that just arbitrarily declares that fishing and four-wheel driving, rugby league and VK Commodores, Southern Cross tattoos and getting on the terps with the boys are just bad things, therefore these must be bad people. So how could a political movement, once the domain of hard-bitten wharfies, become infested with that sort of snivelling fragility that lets us use the word snowflake as a synonym for lefty? The past 30 years have seen a fairly catastrophic sequence of events for the left, some of them unavoidable, but each one predicated on the last. And the initial undoing of the left was just at the hands of Father Time. Our working class is shrinking. If we look at the numbers from the early 90s, 91, more than half of Australian workers worked in jobs that we would consider blue-collar work. Assembling cars, cleaning offices, pushing wheelbarrows. By 2016, blue-collar work accounts for just over a third of our employment. Time, technology. It takes the grunt work out of most of human endeavour. We just don't have the need for strong backs and calloused hands that we used to have. At the same time, the aspirations of the working class, the reason why they cared about their family and working hard and putting a bit of money aside, they started to become realised. The children of factory workers grew up to work in skilled trades. The children of tradies grew up to be clerical workers, and the children of clerical workers grew up to be professionals. So the unfortunate thing about that is tribal allegiance is pretty hard to shift. It's a lot harder to shift than it certainly doesn't move as fast as technology. So these children and grandchildren of the 20th century left still largely view the world through the political lens of their parents. They believe that they are the downtrodden masses, even though their university degrees, their overseas holidays, Gucci loafers, six-figure government-funded salary package put them firmly amongst the world's most well-off people. Growing up in a comfortable middle-class environment has significant advantages over being a couple of heartbeats away from the poverty line. Poverty begets violence, and the modern left have rarely, if ever, experienced the sort of violence that is commonly experienced by true working-class people. Back in the day, even a fist fight wasn't considered violence, as long as you both dusted yourselves off and had a beer together afterwards. So having never experienced actual violence, yet adamantly believing in their own oppression, overgrown children of the modern left naturally grew up believing that the harshest treatment that they ever received was the harshest treatment that anyone could ever receive. They are the oppressed masses, of course. So when you've grown up believing that having someone else say something you don't want to hear is equivalent to a violent attack on your person, you can very easily see the way that privileged university students, on their way to becoming doctors and lawyers, can feel that violently fending off a speaker they disagree with is just as justified as I might feel throwing the first punch is justified if someone threatens to kick the shit out of me. They have literally no point of reference upon which to predicate a proportionate response to things that they don't like. All the while, we have had the union movement, which was referenced by Karen earlier. Previously, the domain of grim-faced coal miners and nurses whose vocabulary would make a Lachlan River shearer blush. They are now populated by career unionists who feel that living the high life on their members' dues is a more attractive fast track to Labor Party pre-selection than holding down an actual job. Once concerned with actually improving the lot of Australia's workers, these parasitic organisations are now almost indistinguishable from the corporations that they claim to despise. In an ever more dire quest for relevance as the working class shrinks, so the deserted class struggle of the 20th century in favour of that postmodern absurdity that is identity politics, but of course cloaked in the gloriously fluffy term social justice. And yes, much like all the other former paragons of the left, they have minced off to join what Helen Dale likes to refer to as the moaning industrial complex. And finally, we have the ever-expanding size and scope of government. It was hilarious when Oscar Wilde coined the quote, "The bureaucracy is expanding to meet the needs of the expanding bureaucracy," and it was still kind of funny when Sir Humphrey said something similar on Yes Minister in the 80s. It's not funny anymore. Our public servant to real job ratio is higher than it's ever been. Much higher, and we'll all just be given our own bureaucrat to look after and feed and clothe, like some sort of corpulent clock-watching Tamagotchi. I know it's not the done thing to come to Friedman and start preaching from the Book of Marx, but aside from all the shit he got wrong, Marx definitely got a few things right, and identifying the conflict of interest between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat was 100% on the money. He just made the mistake of identifying the wrong people as the bourgeoisie. It's not the person that goes and invests everything they own in building a factory and fitting it out and paying other people to work in it who are the enemy of the working class. It's the person that, after all the hard work's been done, they come along and they say, nice business you got here, despite the fact that, I had no input into it, and despite the fact that I actually went out of my way to make your business harder to establish and run. See this gun here? I'm just going to be taking 30% of everything you earn from it from now on. They're the political classes. And by political classes, I don't mean our elected representatives. We've at least got half a chance of firing them every couple of years. I'm talking about, the public servants, the bureaucrats. Each bureaucrat only has a job because another bureaucrat thought the world needed more bureaucrats. Modern day robber barons, stealing from the rich and the poor to give to the moderately well off, aka themselves. There's they are the enemies of the working class, and they are also the enemies of freedom. Great news. They're the sort of people the working class can't stand. People who rely on the public purse, they're going to vote for policies that increase the size of the public purse. We can't blame them. That's just rational self-interest. But it does mean that, while a lot of the actual physical labour that used to be carried out by the public service in terms of maintaining trains and things has been hived off to private contractors, a lot more government jobs are being created for university educated white-collar workers, paid for by the blue-collar workers who've lost their jobs and had to go and find other ones. So more of Marx's ideas have just been beaten down by time and progress. The means of production is not something that only wealthy people can have. There are plenty of people running businesses off a laptop. Uber came in and the working class thought, beauty, we can make some money on the side just doing what we like to do, driving around the city. And it wasn't the wealthy who tried to shut it down, aside from those who'd invested in taxi licences. But it was the bureaucrats, the middle class, the political classes who wanted to shut Uber down because, when you've built a career around, saying that you're helping lift these poor people out of their situation, the idea that they'll just turn around and lift themselves out is pretty terrifying. Marxism just ceases to be relevant when you can earn a living from your mobile phone. So we've come to a point now with the ascendancy of the snowflake left. They're pushing further and further towards that totalitarian nightmare that their grandparents tried to warn them about. So there's more and more lefties, like myself, who are left without a political home. Where do they go? Obviously not to the Greens. The Greens are not the party of the working class. They're more the party of the ageing baby boomer who, having royally fucked both the planet and the economy, now want to socialise the losses by freezing their grandchildren out of the property market. These people are angry. They get told that they're Philistines because they like rugby league, that they're environmental vandals because they can't afford a Prius. They're really angry at being milked dry by this rapacious taxation regime that's seemingly so that the socialites of Toorak and Double Bay can enjoy cheaper opera tickets. So a few of them have been duped into supporting Pauline Hanson. Not because they have any real affiliation with ethno-fascism or anything else that Pauline's actually selling. It's because she talks on their level. It's the only level she can talk on, but she talks on their level. So the working class appreciate that. They don't go in for long-winded philosophical discussions. They're too busy keeping the wolf from the door to spend hours reading Hayek, Hazlitt and Hume. They're distrustful of flowery prose. Anybody that uses 3 words to say something when one would do is obviously trying to hide something. If we are to attract these people to our movement at all, we have to speak to them in a way that they like to be spoken to and speak to other people. If we fail to take that simple step, there will be no shifting the idea that we are simply asking them to vote for us because we want something from them. The first step we need to take, as has been mentioned by both Jonathan and Karen, and is now going to be reiterated by me, is that we need to repackage the message. High-minded intellectual justifications won't fly. I've been as guilty as anyone of standing up here and waffling on for way too long about stuff that, we can just go and read in a book. They need to go in our back pockets, and we need to be presenting our policy ideas almost in bullet point form, using very direct language, describing exactly how what we are proposing will improve their situation. We'll try a little example now. Tax policy. If you earn average wages, each year you're handing over almost $12,000 to the federal government. Under the Liberal Democrats' policy, you'd pay $5,000. That's $7,000 worth of wealthy people's private schooling, solar panels and opera tickets that you don't need to be paying for. We think you'd be able to spend that money better yourself. That's 65 words. You could almost fit it in a tweet. You could probably bring it down by another 20, but in 65 words, I've given it a fairly verifiable and digestible summary of how our tax policy is going to affect the weight of their wallet. We're not trying to take anything from you. We're not trying to get anything. We just want to give you back more of what's yours. The other pricks are taking it off you. We'll help you get it back and then leave you alone. You do the same thing with pretty much any policy. Cannabis. Who hasn't smoked a bit of weed occasionally? And surely the police have better things to do than put our kids through the courts for smoking a joint. Make it legal, sell it to adults, let the government have the GST on it. That's another $500 million they don't need to take off workers. 63 words, and even if you're not keen on the idea of smoking cannabis yourself or your kids smoking cannabis, then it's very difficult to argue that the proceeds from the sale of cannabis should still go to organised crime groups rather than to their kids' schools. It can be a very easy sell if we just take the time to package that message. There's nothing dumbed down about this. It's nothing I'm doing is an abstraction. I've written very lengthy articles saying exactly the same things but using 20 times the number of words. Publishers don't like it when you just tweet your articles at them. A big trend in marketing at the moment is to create personas, which are representative of the key segments of your intended market. For example, you can create a persona called Davo. Davo's a brickies labourer from Townsville. He's got a missus and 2 kids, earns 60 grand a year and enjoys fishing, fixing up cars, the occasional flutter on the horses and getting on the terps with the boys on a Friday night. Okay, instantly we know how to talk to Davo. Yeah, and the thousands of other Davos that are out there. You know, we've got an idea of what makes him tick. You know, what's more important is we've got an idea of what pisses him off. If we start talking about Laffer curves or self-ownership, then Davo's just going to call us a pack of wankers and tell us to piss off. So we can now package our message in a way that hopefully will resonate with Davo, something he can bring out on Friday night when he's getting on the cans and he can feel like the smartest bloke in the room. The other thing we really need to rein in is the criticism of people who are not yet libertarians. You know, I will stick my hand up and say that yes, I am, and probably will continue to be quite brutal in smacking down people who claim to be libertarian but espouse authoritarian ideals. So that's not what I'm talking about. It's people who haven't yet made that connection that, you know, less tax, less government, more freedom doesn't automatically translate into some sort of automatic panacea for all their troubles. So instead of dismissing them as part of the problem, as was mentioned earlier, we need to be going back to step one, repackage the message. You're obviously not selling it right if people aren't buying it. But, you know, the fact that they're, you know, keen to still talk to you indicates that they're open-minded and interested enough. And they might not agree with you the first time, they might not agree with you the fifth time you talk about it, but they're still winnable. So yeah, be kind to them, help them. You know, there's bound to be a pain point or two where we can make them see the benefits of less government, and then you just broaden the scope from there. Don't worry about the people that continually engage with you just because they want to prove how wrong you are. They're a waste of space, and just give them no oxygen at all. You know. So having babbled on for, just giving my red card now, having babbled on for probably far longer than I meant to, what you should be taking away is that there are a large group of people out there, westerly, that have been left without a political home. They may have come from the left, but they are not of the left today. Like any of us, they respond to incentives. We just need to figure out what incentives to dangle in front of them. They have concerns about the size, scope and nature of government, just like us. They like to speak directly and bluntly, and they respond well to others who do the same. So our policy pitches need to be short, sharp, to the point. We have to present them in a way that clearly illustrates the benefits to them, and we catch more flies with honey than vinegar. You know, we've got some snarky motherfuckers in our midst, and they're hilarious, but try and keep the bloodletting in-house, maybe. So that's enough from me. Make sure you come along to the gala dinner tonight, where I'll be delving even further into my intimate and personal relationship with our Lord and Saviour, Johnny Cash. So have a great conference.